Morning, folks. Welcome to our live webinar hosted on Zoom. We're also live streaming the talk on YouTube, which I guess means I can finally tag myself as an influencer on my LinkedIn profile. My name is John Farrell, and I'm a partner on the technology team, the technology source and innovation team here in Mason Hayes and Curran, and I'm joined by my colleague Wendy Hederman, who's also a partner on the TSI team.
Morning all. Thank you for joining us.
So this morning, we're going to look beyond, I guess, the immediate COVID-19 crisis to consider some of the key changes that are taking place at an EU level around consumer protection law. And I suppose reforming and strengthening the digital single market has been a key goal of the EU for the past few years. And we've already seen a number of pieces of new legislation arise out of this. So for those of you that have joined us on some of our previous webinars, you'll know how we tend to run them. But for the benefit of first-time viewers, how we're going to structure the session is a more conversational style between myself and Wendy, where we explore a series of different issues or themes on consumer protection law that either have been recently reformed or where there's changes coming down the track. We do have slides for each topic and some broad points. These are there really more to keep myself and Wendy on track from a timing side, and also to make sure we cover all of the big issues. So don't worry too much about trying to take in all the information on the slides, as we'll circulate them after the session. Also, we want to try and keep it as practical as possible, so we're leaving plenty of time at the end to answer questions. So do feel free to type them into the Q&A box, and we'll go through as many of these as we can at the end. Okay, so I guess let's dive right into it and look at it from, I guess, a high-level perspective before we look at some of the specific changes. It's probably a good opportunity to pass over to you, Wendy. In terms of big picture here, you know, where are we heading with consumer law in the EU? Like, do you think this is going to be the next big area of regulatory reform and change?
Yes, John, I mean, consumer protection is definitely in the midst of an overhaul. I mean, maybe best described as being, you know, beefed up to meet the challenges of e-commerce across borders and the EU's digital single market objectives. Consumer protection has been around for a long time. You know, the unfair contract terms dates back to 1993, and the EU does have some of the strongest consumer protection laws anywhere in the world. But when the EU Commission did a review, I think a fitness review, and published their results back in 2016, 2017, they found that consumer protection law was outdated in a few respects. It had gaps. It didn't cover a lot of new types of products, which combined soft goods, services and software, that whole distinction, and also that so much now of what people purchase is online, and that fits with the digital single market objective of ensuring that, you know, that is encouraged. But then one of the big things they found was that it lacked effective enforcement. Basically, it was very patchy or inconsistent, or in some instances almost non-existent enforcement among the member states. So that review led to what was called the New Deal for Consumers, and several pieces of legislation that we're going to look at today come from that New Deal for Consumers.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a good point for us to jump into the specific legislation, you know, and start looking at the things that are coming down the track in really the next 18 months or so. So I think the first one is probably, like, for my money, one of the most important ones, sometimes called the Omnibus Directive, or the Enforcement and Modernisation Directive. This is one that's been as we'll for reasons we'll come to in a moment, one that's been getting a lot of people's attention. So do you want to take us through some of the headline points, Wendy?
Yeah, I mean, it probably is right that it's getting attention, because this will be a game changer. The Omnibus Directive does two things. As it says, it's enforcement and modernisation. So maybe very briefly taking the enforcement piece, this is what will introduce GDPR-style fines, the turnover-based penalties. The modernisation piece is that it will amend the existing legislation, which is there on the slide, EU consumer protection laws that you'll be familiar with. The Omnibus Directive has 9 short articles, some shorter, some longer. Each of them does some fairly significant things. amending the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, amending the Consumer Rights Directive, the Unfair Contract Terms, and the Price Indications Directive. And then in each of those pieces of legislation, it adds in the penalties, the higher turnover-based fines. So this will, particularly as regards the much higher enforcement, it will make a significant difference to the way in which consumer protection law operates in the EU, and I suppose the attention that businesses really should be giving to consumer protection legislation. The deadlines are that the member states must adopt national measures to implement this directive by November 2021, and those measures must be effective by the latest 28th of May 2022. And that sounds like a long way off, but in fact, we know from preparation.
It's not a long way at all.
No, and particularly when you need to go through all of your consumer-facing terms and practices and get your house in order and be in a good position for when those fines come in.
Particularly with the current crisis, I mean, like, you know, people are just so focused on COVID-19 at the moment, but, you know, this is not stopping the clock for when this sort of stuff is coming in. So definitely it's worth keeping those timelines in mind. Maybe we'll just look at, like, dive into the detail a little bit more, and like, there's an awful lot here, but, you know, it might be useful just to talk about maybe 4 or 5 of the biggest things that, you know, sort of me or you have taken out from our reads of the legislation. Do you want to talk us through the first couple, and then maybe I'll pick up the second couple?
Yeah, and I would say quite a few of these big changes are relating to online business. So the first there, the transparency of search results. Both the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and the Consumer Rights Directive requires that marketplaces disclose to the consumer the main parameters by which their search results are ranked and the relevance of those parameters. So, and this will apply regardless of whether a sale is actually concluded. So it's in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. They must also, there's also going to be a prohibition on sort of hidden advertising or traders paying for placement in search results. You have to disclose to consumers where there is paid placement in search results. And the other area of sort of transparency related to marketplaces and online activity is as to whether the seller is a business seller or a private seller. So, for example, if I buy a set of headphones online, if I'm buying them from Harvey Norman, I get the protections of consumer law because that's a business to consumer transaction. Whereas if I buy them, for example, from John because he's got a spare set of headphones he's offloading after Christmas, well, I won't have the protection of consumer law. And websites have to be much clearer as to whether the seller is a private seller or a business. And actually they will have to call out that I won't have consumer protections if I buy them from a private seller.
Yeah.
Do you want to, John, talk about the other things on this slide?
Yeah, so I think the changes they're making around user reviews and really tightening up that whole process are interesting. So I guess there's 2 angles to it, you know, in terms of restricting companies from posting their own reviews, and then also requiring them to take steps to deal with the submission of false reviews. So I think that's been an area where has been a lot of concern for people. So it's good to see some changes coming in there. This idea of price personalization, and particularly where it's based on automated decision making, the requirement to make that much more transparent, similar to some of the concepts from GDPR around this idea of automated decision making and profiling. So there's changes coming in there. Dual quality products. This has been another kind of hot topic issue throughout the EU. So it's going to be an unfair commercial practice to market goods as being identical to goods marketed in other EU member states, where those goods have, excuse me, significantly different composition or characteristics, unless this can be objectively justified. I think this is going to start bringing it in line with existing position around dual quality food products. And in terms of price promotions, I think it's also interesting that there'll be a requirement on traders to state previous selling prices where they're running this price promotion. You know, we've all seen these kind of never-ending sort of promotions or sales. But again, it's just that drive towards more transparency, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that area about price promotions, I mean, Irish law is fairly lax about the reference price or the reference period, for which, you know, when you say now 50% off or at a discount. Some member states had tighter laws, but this will require more specificity when you're saying 30% off or 50% off, or for how long a promotion is available. And one other change that comes in the Omnibus Directive is where consumers give personal data in exchange for services or digital content. It comes in as well in the Digital Content Directive, so we might deal with it then, but it is interesting when personal data is sort of the price for goods or services.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the days of these kind of free apps and things like that, it's going to be much more regulation around that. Okay, I guess maybe moving on to the most important part, arguably, of the Omnibus Directive, and it's the aspect, I suppose, it's gotten the most attention. Unsurprising, because there's nothing like giving regulators greater teeth or bringing in more enforcement powers to get people's attention. I think there was a real sense that the consumer law throughout the EU didn't do enough to empower regulators, and also didn't do enough to empower consumers to deal with those really significant breaches of consumer law. And I think this discussion, like, it really intensified after the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal, and there was a lot of support and drive towards moving towards the kind of the competition style or the GDPR style of enforcement, and creating that strong regime. Do you want to just maybe talk us through some of the highlights of what's proposed in the Omnibus Directive around fines and enforcement?
Yeah, so the Omnibus Directive it slots into those consumer protection laws that we've known and had around for a long time. It slots in these additional and ramped up penalties. I mean, there's a principle that penalties must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. That's not new in terms of a concept, but really it's been found that the penalties in most member states are not effective or dissuasive. Like when the Unfair Consumer Terms legislation came in Ireland, the maximum fine was £1,500, and that's really enough to stop
behaviours.
Yeah. So now the requirement is that each member state must have in its laws that the maximum penalties be not less than 4% of a trader's annual turnover in that member state, or in the relevant member states, or when they can't work out, or when the turnover isn't available, then the maximum fine must be no less than 2 million euros. So the 4% is similar to GDPR, the 2 million is definitely less than we have in GDPR, but what is noteworthy is that this will not prevent member states from having higher levels of fine. So I think that at the moment in some countries, Netherlands, Poland, I think they have fines of up to 10% of turnover. And in fact, we have seen in some member states in recent years, like for example in France, it was a competition and consumer authority that imposed a fine of 25 million on Apple earlier this year for breaches of consumer law, misleading emissions related to new operating system. So, you know, they're the sort of headline grabbing things that do make businesses pay attention. And very briefly, I'd say that member states have to have it in their laws that the fines are determined in accordance with an indicative list of criteria. So they are things like that the nature, gravity, scope and duration of the infringement has to be taken into account, any mitigating factors, any remedies already provided by the trader, whether they're a repeat offender, and also how widespread whether they have made a financial gain or avoided losses by engaging in this illegal practice. So similar criteria to GDPR, but with a few tweaks. And these fines will must apply in each member state by the latest May 2022. I think it's probably worth repeating that there are definitely learnings from GDPR, and I think the EU Commission in proposing legislation has itself learnt from GDPR. But would you take us through on some of these points?
Yeah, so like I suppose the in terms of the biggest takeaway is probably the most obvious, but I guess it is worth repeating again that, you know, the prospects of big fines really does concentrate the mind of businesses and gets the attention of senior management. You know, 4 or 5 figure fines, particularly for big, you know, multinational companies, probably not going to change behavior. You're getting into 6, 7, 8 figure fines. They're the things that drive real change, and that's what the EU wants. You know, in the pre-GDPR days, I guess there was a lot of attitude from companies that, you know, data protection was something that applied to technology companies, but it kind of didn't really impact everyone else. I think there's been a real mindset change on that. You know, everybody knows they've data protection obligations now. I think we're going to see a similar change with consumer laws. You know, anytime you have that interaction with consumers, even maybe not directly within the supply chain, as we'll come to later on, but you're just going to have to be conscious of what these rules are and know that if you get them wrong, you could be on the wrong end of a fairly significant fine. And I suppose 2 other points that are just worth mentioning briefly. I think what we'll see is people are going to start becoming a lot more knowledgeable about their rights under this legislation. I think we've seen that with GDPR. People know what their rights are a lot more. I think the second thing is that having a proactive rather than a reactive approach really pays off dividends. You know, you've seen with the companies that put in the hard yards around the implementation of GDPR, they're in a much better position now to deal with breaches and things like that compared to companies that just sort of went through the motions. So I think, look, that's kind of a good overview of it, but maybe like, is there's a lot there, Wendy. Maybe is there, you know, a couple of points just to kind of take away with the Omnibus Directive?
Yeah, well, I suppose the main points to remember are that the rules that you know about from before have been extended. There are more of the online activities that are now targeted by this Omnibus Directive, things like fake customer reviews, hidden advertising, transparency around ranking. All of those things are what businesses are going to need to get ready to comply with. And then that the cost of getting it wrong is ramping up dramatically. So as you say, it sounds familiar to people who've dealt with GDPR in recent years, and the same rationale is driving it. That increased enforcement should lead to better compliance and better protections for consumers. So probably time to move on to another significant change that is coming in. And again, there's been a little bit of talk around this. Could you take us, John, to the Digital Content Directive? Okay, I think we've frozen there. Okay, I'm not sure whether any of you can hear John. I can't. The next issue we were going to speak about was the Digital Content Directive. I mean, this is another game changer in terms of legislation. It is consumer law up to date around selling digital services and digital content. You will know there's been a much greater move towards digital content in the last 10 years. And in practice, for those of us advising businesses, it has, there have been gaps between the old sale of goods legislation and the provisions that dealt with services. And the legislation just didn't fully deal with the types of online content, apps and software that was available. So firstly, to deal with when does this apply? Well, this comes in January 2022. It's effectively close to a full harmonization measure to try and create a unified and consistent level of protection across.
Sorry, Wendy. I think I cut out on you there.
You did. I wanted to cut out everybody or just me.
I'd say probably everybody. The joys of working from home. But hopefully we're back up and running now, and everyone can see the slides. Just put a message in the comments box if you can't. But hopefully that's the end of the IT issues.
Okay, so John, I'll hand back to you. So can you tell us what does this Digital Content Directive apply to?
Yeah, so it's going to capture things like digital content, so games and ebooks, digital services, so streaming, SaaS platforms. I guess where it doesn't apply is around issues around interconnected goods, so like the software on smart TVs and stuff, and there's real interconnection with the Consumer Sales Directive, which we'll touch on in a few minutes. Also, things excluded are the likes of healthcare, but healthcare apps are included, and it also doesn't capture things like open source software. I think coming back to something you mentioned briefly at the start around this idea of paying for content with personal data. So even where you're getting a free service or digital content, but you're paying for it with the provision of personal information, that's going to bring you within the scope of the directive. Now, there's a couple of carve-outs. So if you're collecting information or processing it purely for the purposes of supplying the digital content or the service, that's carved out. So if you take like a map app, you have to process location data as part of that to provide the service. That's fine. You won't be within the scope. But obviously, if you're doing something else with the data, then it'll bring you back within it.
Like and also, if you're using the location data for the purposes of giving them targeted advertising.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That will bring you back in within the scope of having paid for it with your data. Also, if you're processing it for legal requirements, so that would be something like anti-money laundering legislation. So if you're just doing it for that purpose, you're going to be outside the scope. In terms of, I guess, sort of the liability and redress point, I won't labour on some of these issues, because they're similar enough to some of the concepts we have in existing consumer laws. But this idea of, giving the trader an ability to remedy it in the first instance, and then you move on to other potential redress measures. This idea of conformity and having the digital content or service in conformity with how it's described, I think that's important because it looks at it from a few different angles, and some of them are kind of new concepts. You have this idea of a subjective conformity, which is fitness for purpose, which consumers have made known or as detailed in a contract. You also have this concept of objective criteria, which is what are these type of products or digital content or service used for normally, and do they possess the features that one would expect from similar products. Particularly included here is statements made on or behalf of the trader or indeed persons in the link of the transaction. So it may not even be necessarily the trader that makes them. One interesting thing I thought worth mentioning, and it's in the recitals, is this idea that privacy by design is included within the objective criteria. I think that's interesting because, again, you see this interlinking with privacy law principles, and that's really driving towards that digital single market, and that's really what the EU is looking to strengthen. In terms of non-conformity, it makes a difference between single supply, so you just provide something once, and this idea of continuous supply. Where it's continuous supply, you need to keep it the conformity for the length of the agreement. Single supply, you have that 2-year period, which exists in some other legislation. Where the defect arises within the first year, it's presumed to have been there at the time of supply. But there are duties for the consumer. They have to cooperate with the trader to try and determine what was the issue. So, for example, was it just something like an interoperability issue, or some other technical issue that caused the lack of conformity, as opposed to the digital content. There's also new updating obligations. So the trader will have to keep the digital content or digital service in conformity. If the consumer fails to install updates in timely manners, this can impact whether they have a right of remedy because of a lack of conformity arising out of that. And again, a lot of the sort of remedies for lack of conformity are things we're used to, things like price reduction, opportunities to bring it into conformity, and maybe even termination. There are carve-outs for disproportionate efforts, for example, around things like free products, where actually, the cost of what it is to bring it into conformity would be just disproportionate. When you talk about, I guess, the Digital Content Directive, the directive that goes hand in hand with that is the Sale of Goods Directive. So do you want to just take us through maybe a couple of the high level points in this, Wendy? A lot of it builds on existing legislation, but there are a couple of interesting points, right?
Yeah, and this Sale of Goods Directive hasn't had as much attention as the Digital Content Directive. I mean, yes, maybe because there's more new stuff in the Digital Content Directive, but actually quite a bit of the ideas and principles in the Digital Content Directive are now being applied to goods that have digital elements. So goods with software, where the software is required to make that good function, whether it won't work without the software. They come within the Goods Directive, and the Sale of Goods Directive and the Digital Content Directive in the main clauses and also in the recitals try and get this alignment or the consistency between the Goods Directive and the Digital Content Directive, so that
it's tricky though.
Beside each other, but with no gaps. That you're either within one or the other. Not always terribly clear. The Goods Directive, for example, will apply to smart TVs. It'll apply to, let's say, fitness trackers, the physical tracker. Whereas if all you're getting is a fitness app, then you're in the digital content. Some of the new things in the Goods Directive are similar to what you were talking about. I mean, that 2-year guarantee has always been there, but member states are able to keep a longer period. And we know that's caused problems under Irish law because we have a 6-year thing. So yes, this is a directive. It's described as in certain places as full harmonization to make it easier for traders to trade across borders. In fact, it's not. There are several places where member states can adopt different provisions, how long the guarantee is for second-hand goods, a few things like that. The other issue that you mentioned, digital content, which is really interesting for goods, is updates. So there'll be an obligation on a seller of goods with digital elements to update them, not just for as long as it is as it's stated in the contract, but also by this objective criteria of how long it's reasonable to expect that it would be available. A non-conformity would be considered to be where the installation instructions aren't clear. So if the consumer is expected to install the software or download an app to make the goods work, and the consumer doesn't do that properly, well, the trader could be liable if their installation instructions weren't clear enough.
Yeah.
Also, the remedies, it should simplify a little bit what we have in existing Irish law, where we have this complicated matrix across 3 sets of legislation. The remedies are, in the first place, repair or replacement. The consumer can call for either repair or replacement. The trader has some sort of ways out of that if the remedy is disproportionate or not cost effective. And then there are also the remedies called out of price reduction or termination and the circumstances in which those remedies would apply. There are also changes to the guarantees legislation. It replaces the previous directive in this area. Noteworthy change is that the consumer guarantee will have to be given to the consumer on durable medium, not just if the consumer requests it, but actually has to be provided along with the sale. And if the trader has made more extensive kind of promises as regards that commercial guarantee in advertisements or pre-sale statements, then that's what will legally bind the trader and not the narrower terms that are within the legal commercial guarantee. So as with the Digital Content Directive, this comes into effect from January 2022. And I think there are quite a few changes for sellers of goods, particularly goods with digital elements, that will take some time to get right their process as regards updates, installation, the duration of the contract, the conformity. So, you know, definitely one that's worth preparing for.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we might maybe just move on to something that's a little bit more immediate, I guess, in terms of when it's going to take effect, and that's the online platform regulations. I think, you know, there's a lot of really interesting aspects to it, not least that it's kind of phrased as a B2B, but actually, you know, it kind of has at its heart that consumer protection element. Do you want to just take us through some of the bigger points from it? Well, it's July, it's coming into effect, right?
Yeah, that's less than 2 months' time.
Yeah.
A lot of the big platforms are well on their way to preparing or are ready to comply with this. I mean, what is interesting is that platforms, I thought by one count, there are possibly 7,000 to 8,000 platforms or online intermediation services, as they're described in this platform regulation, that will be bound by the provisions of this regulation. So that's e-commerce marketplaces, auction websites, price comparison websites, app stores, anywhere where there's a platform where consumers can purchase or acquire goods from a third party. And the concepts in here as regards transparency of search results, fairness in the way in which the relationship between platform and trader builds on a lot of the same concepts in consumer law, but as you said, interestingly, this applies to the B2B interaction between the platform and traders. So it is the two main areas in the interaction between platforms and traders are the terms and conditions. So the terms must be clear and intelligible. The terms can't be changed willy-nilly by the platform. There's a minimum 15-day notice of changes. There's a minimum 30 days for terminating the platform service, or for and if you delist a trader's goods, there has to be reasons given, an appeal mechanism. There's a has to be a published complaints procedure for traders to use. The platform has to have the names of at least 2 mediators available there on the website to whom traders can refer their dispute with the platform. And so, I mean, that's, you know, fairly far reaching in terms of the interaction between the platforms and the traders. There's also a second section of this platform regulation which applies only to search engines. Do you want to?
Yeah. So I think, as you said, look, there's a lot of focus on the platform side of it because it'll impact a lot more businesses. But yeah, it's a lot of interesting stuff on the search engine side as well. You know, more detailed transparency and disclosure requirements for search engines, and this idea of preparing public disclosures, explaining ranking practices and the parameters that underpin the ranking, and, you know, reasons for relative importance and things like that. So like there's a lot of you know, important changes are going to come into effect in terms of how search engines operate, and I think it'll be interesting to see after July, you know, how that actually looks in practice. I'm just conscious of time, so we might move on maybe to the last topic, because I know this is actually particularly interesting stuff coming out of this in terms of the more practical effects of this kind of cross-border cooperation. So in terms of the CPC regulation, like there's always been that good sort of framework of cross-jurisdictional assistance, but the regulation came in January has really strengthened that, right? Yeah,
and I suppose there has been that cooperation. It hasn't had a particularly strong legal framework. The consumer protection authorities in the various member states have done some really interesting work over the last couple of years, and like the output of the reviews that they did of multi-jurisdictional traders, the big guys like Facebook, Twitter, the Google Plus, and more recently Airbnb and Booking.com. I mean, you can see that they're the kind of activities that are difficult for, or not that they're difficult, but probably has more effect when the consumer protection authorities cooperate across the EU, and what I find really interesting about those coordinated actions is that it gives a really good indication of the types of practices that the consumer protection authorities consider to be unfair, or consider are in breach of the rules. Drip pricing, adding fees as a consumer goes through the booking process, not being clear whether you're dealing with a professional seller or a consumer seller, being able to cut users off a platform without giving good reason. So a lot of stuff that has now come into the new legislation is evident there, and it's worthwhile for businesses to have a look at the output of those actions. And also then they have done general sweeps for ascertaining the level of compliance of websites across Europe with requirements of EU consumer law. But I suppose to bring us to the CPC regulation, this was passed in 2017, came into effect there earlier in January, hasn't got a whole lot of attention. It's probably because it's something there, it's kind of that works in the background, but it does significantly step up the enforcement powers that each consumer protection authority in each country has. So effectively, member states had to make sure that their laws gave their national consumer protection authorities the sort of 8 or 10 powers to tackle unlawful consumer activity. So each consumer protection authority must be able to carry out test purchases and to do mystery shopping. The authority has to be able to request information from domain registries and from banks so that they can identify who exactly is this rogue trader that's online. They're also able to order platforms like eBay and Amazon to delist traders who are breaching consumer laws. And actually they're even able to order domain registries to close off and block off websites in their entirety if they are in breach of consumer law. So they're, we haven't seen them being used yet, but they are powers that came in January 2020 and provide important additional tools for national authorities in tackling online activity.
Yeah, and like we seen an element of that, didn't we, with the COVID-19 crisis, in terms of this common position being taken, and the action from at an EU level almost within the network, where right into platforms and social media and search engines and marketplaces to try and get items delisted. Like I think you had a good stat of from eBay in terms of numbers of listings. It was in the millions anyway, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was about 15 million. I mean, it's a good example, and our listeners could go and have a quick look on the CPC website. That in March 2020, so within sort of 10 days of the real COVID-19 crisis across Europe, the CPC authority issued a common position on the sort of scams and poor consumer practices they were seeing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like, for example, fake claims that goods could, or that medicines or devices could either prevent the spread of disease or would help in protecting consumers, or scaremongering as regards of supplies. And yeah, the CPC issued this common position, and then they wrote to a load of the platforms, so to Alibaba, eBay, Amazon, and yes, there was such quite significant results from that those platforms were reminded of their obligations to take down products that had false claims, and eBay took off 15 million of their listings that were violating the coronavirus policies.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, I think that's probably a good note to kind of end the main part, and we might just sort of summarize a couple of kind of key takeaways just in advance of moving on to the Q&As. I guess the first one, from my perspective, would be this idea of awareness and management buy-in. We're kind of within that lead-in time now of when this is, these changes are going to go live, and trying to get you know, people, the right people within the organization interested in these changes and what needs to be done to make sure you're compliant. I think the enhanced fines criteria is definitely going to help that. I think another one is this idea of sort of auditing your existing processes. So you're kind of looking at all elements of the consumer journey. So, you know, what information are you supplying? And it's not just, you know, within your terms and conditions, you know, going back to some of the things we talked about, like even statements being made that can be held against you, information you provide, you know, how do your terms and conditions work? Is that real drive towards, you know, clarity and transparency and ease of use, which really kind of underpin GDPR as well, and some of the other changes recently as part of the digital single market. I might pass over to you then for the last two kind of key takeaways.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the overall learning that I've had from reviewing all of this new legislation is that businesses really do need to move away from just taking consumer protection as a sort of, oh, well, we sort of just about tick the box there as sort of a bare minimum, what can we get away with kind of thing. Need to move to really wholeheartedly engaging and being fully compliant with the consumer protection laws, because, you know, the cost of getting it wrong would definitely be a lot higher than previously. And, you know, as you said, those big fines will help businesses realize, okay, you know, let's actually really make the effort to make our consumer interactions fair, transparent, compliant, you know, not that have sneaky things in there, not trying to get away, and that our customer service on things like withdrawals and cancellations and guarantees and after sales and the level of updates, or when we provide updates, that all of that is actually consumer friendly. And I think also probably important to monitor developments across in your main European markets, because quite a bit of what we spoke about today is in directives, it's not regulations, and there will be differences between the EU member states. And because there's opportunity for member states to bring in tougher laws in some parts, it might be worth, you know, keep an eye on sort of doing a bit of lobbying in the countries which are big markets on the that matter to you.
Absolutely. Okay, well, look, I think that kind of brings us to the end of what we wanted to say. So probably a good opportunity to jump into some of the Q&A. So just when you were running through your key takeaways, I was having a quick look at some of the questions. So I might just take one of them here now. So will the new laws allow class action lawsuits in the EU? So I think it's a really good question, and there's actually just so much happening with consumer reform now that this is actually one of the areas we actually couldn't even talk about today. This idea of collective redress. I think, yes, it's not what we covered today, but it's definitely coming in a concept. You know, we're not going to have that kind of US style class action lawsuit, but particularly coming out of the Volkswagen scandal, there was a real sense that there just wasn't enough powers for consumers to take on these bad practices. So this collective redress idea, you know, it's going to be much more policed in the sense that it's you know, certain organizations can take them, and it'll have that oversight from public authorities, but it will bring in that form of collective action, which is going to be a key pillar to what the EU are trying to achieve here, I think.
Okay, right, John, I'll take a few that I can do with very brief. The first one, is it possible to get a copy of the slides? Yes, absolutely. We will be sending those on along with a link to a recording of this webinar, so you can listen back to it, or you can share it with colleagues. Another one very briefly, okay, what you consider the other most important piece of EU legislation apart from those on the Omnibus Directive? I think the Digital Content Directive is probably the next most important after the Omnibus. Don't forget about the Goods Directive. Question here about, and this is from Eric, is the directive transnational in application like GDPR? And how do you envisage enforcement playing out in practice where the vendor is not located in a member state? Okay, well, where the vendor isn't in a member state, yes, the consumer rules will apply. I mean, the position currently is that consumer protection rules apply where a trader directs his sale into a country, which means, shipping to that country or having a website that's directed to that country. So just setting yourself up outside the EU is not going to prevent the application of these consumer protection laws. And is the directive transnational in application? No, really, it still applies on a country by country basis on where the consumers are based, depending on whether you direct your trade to that country. But there will be this coordinated enforcement across the countries, but there isn't the same one-stop shop. So you could definitely face enforcement action in several member states.
Yeah.
Do you want to take anything
else
there?
I'll take one here. How do the regulations apply to goods available for rental via an online platform where there's no possibility to purchase these items? So I think this is probably would be captured within that concept of it'd be digital content directive again, but you're probably caught within a digital service. It's more the sort of apps purchase and stuff is the digital content, but probably extreme in platforms and things like that, probably more likely to be a digital service. But broadly, a lot of the same principles will continue to apply.
Okay, I think that answers the question as well. Does the directive apply to subscriptions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's...
It will, yeah. And you'll have that continuous obligation. So where it is a subscription service of conformity, it's that continuous obligation of conformity because it's for the life of the, as long as you're a subscriber, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, another one here. Does this cover financial services apps, e.g. apps from banks to enable online banking? I think it will. I think we need to look quite, because there is other financial services legislation.
Yeah.
But the app itself, in terms of how that functions, if that is a digital service.
Yeah.
So I think it is going to apply. Probably the content of what is transacted on the app may be regulated instead by financial services legislation. But and actually this reminds me, in relation to representative actions and collective redress, when I viewed the drafts of that legislation, it's not in yet, I was struck by how extensive the list of legislation that will be the subject of collective actions is. There are about 58 or 60 pieces of legislation to which collective actions will apply, including most of the financial services, so the banks dealing with consumers. It'll also apply to telecoms legislation, to energy labelling, to medical devices, to defective liability for defective products. Now, I don't know if that entire list is going to end up in the final draft of the directive, but that is something that financial services companies will need to be aware of, this idea of collective redress.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of go back to the question, I think similar to like healthcare. So healthcare is excluded, like if we take digital content directive, but healthcare apps are within it, and it's similar with financial services. Like financial services as a concept is not included, but the kind of the digital part of that probably will. A little bit of kind of grey area in there, but yeah, certainly it's not that it's going to be completely outside, I think. I might take one here. Read the new laws that will apply when a consumer pays with personal data. Does that mean that every time a seller collects personal data, for example, if a consumer opts into receiving marketing materials when signing up for a free e-zine or a podcast, does that bring the transaction within the scope of the digital content directive? It's a good question. I think probably is the answer. I think it'll depend on the circumstances. So if you're giving access to, so if you're collecting information for somebody to sign up to an e-zine or something like that, that's getting into marketing rules from a GDPR perspective. But if you're requiring somebody to create an account and I suppose provide personal information to get access to content, be that paywalled content or a podcast or something like that, I think it will be captured within, because you're collecting that personal information and you're using it for something outside of just purely what's needed to provide the service. So yeah, I think a lot of those scenarios will get captured by it.
Okay. Okay, I think we're probably up against time, so I will, there are a few here thanking us for our overview. I'm delighted to hear that. So that's what I was going to answer there. Does Mason Hayes, this is from John, does Mason Hayes have a view of the current CCP position on companies offering credits / delayed refunds to consumers facing companies in the travel space? That's an interesting one where the legal position comes up against, there are very tough circumstances that the travel industry is in. I mean, I think the EU Commission and the various consumer authorities are pretty clear, what's required. The travel directives that if the airline cancels a flight, they must give the refund within 7 days. So that's what's in the law. I know it's not what's happening in practice. So I think for now, as legal advice, we'd have to tell you that is the position, is the 7-day refund.
Yeah, I think it's the reality of the crisis that there's a lot of these kind of, like what's practical for the companies, and it's a tricky one. And I know, like I've seen it mentioned a couple of times in a few different countries that, like, will they bring in something to try and regulate this specific issue? So I think it's kind of a wait and see at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. And then one here from Dermot says, is there a risk that many firms have assumed that their governance policies would be sufficient to meet the demands here? Yes, there is that risk. But I think, and I hope we've shown in the course of this short presentation, that there are quite a few new elements that businesses need to get their heads around. They need to check, are they complying with them? In fact, there are new rules which I would be surprised if every business was already complying with. And I think, as I said, businesses need to move from a sort of bare minimum, what can we get away with, to fully engaging and complying. And I think the fact, as you said, that the high fines will presumably become a reality, that the 25 million that we saw in France against Apple, and by the way, that was an agreed fine. Apple accepted that because of where that investigation was heading, or the 10 million that was applied by the Italian Consumer Protection Authority against Facebook for its practices in terms of the consumer information that it gave when collecting data or signing up people to Facebook. That 10 million, that's not the kind of thing we've seen in Ireland or the UK or in other countries, but will become more common. And that definitely will focus the minds of businesses.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing, really. We've seen it with data protection. It's that and competition law and other areas. That's the sort of thing that drives real change. Okay, well, look, I think we've gone a little bit over time, but I think that probably brings us to the end. So I guess just to say thanks again for everyone for tuning in. I hope you found it useful. The copy of the slides and a link to the recording will be circulated afterwards. So thanks very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody.